Hi, and welcome to the third video in the income maintenance module. This video will cover justice involvement and some of the ways involvement with the criminal justice system can impact your client's income assistance. In this video, we'll go over what can happen to those receiving income assistance who are taken into custody, as well as those coming out of custody. Then we'll take a look at what happens to recipients on parole or probation, and how this might impact their income assistance. We'll wrap up by taking a look at some other common issues that might come up, including things like assistance being paid to a third party and lost income assistance checks. Let's start by taking a look at what happens to Ontario Works and ODSP recipients who are in custody, and how you might be able to help if this happens to your client. As a quick reminder, Ontario Works and ODSP both offer two types of payments in addition to health benefits. These payments are divided into basic needs support and shelter support. As a general rule, neither program will provide income support to someone who's in custody, whether they're waiting for a court date or if they're serving a sentence. But there are some exceptions to this rule. These exceptions are for non-single recipients, someone serving a part-time sentence or a conditional sentence, and someone on temporary absence. Let's cover each of these in a bit more detail. We'll start with the first exception, someone who isn't single. If you have a client in custody who's supporting family members with their income assistance, then their payment should still be provided to them, but reduced to exclude their needs while they're in custody. This means that how much money your client would have received for their basic needs will be subtracted from the total support amount for the days that they spend in custody. But the money your client receives on behalf of their family members should still be provided. If your client is supporting a family on their income assistance, and the family isn't receiving any assistance while your client is in custody, you should refer them to their caseworker. But if their payments aren't reinstated after that, you should refer them for legal advice. Another exception is anyone serving a part-time sentence. Someone who's serving a part-time sentence can still receive both their basic needs support and their shelter support. Their basic needs support will likely be reduced to account for the number of days that they spend in custody, but if they're trying to maintain their housing or secure new housing, their full shelter support might still be available to them. And you should remind your client to talk to their caseworker about this to avoid things like an eviction or to help them find new housing if they need it. Anyone who's serving a conditional sentence will also have different rules. Someone who's serving a conditional sentence is still eligible to receive their income assistance. If they're under house arrest, they should still be eligible for basic needs and shelter support. But if they're serving that sentence in a community residence, like a halfway house or a community bed, they won't be able to receive any shelter support. They can still receive some basic needs support though, unless the community residence that they're staying in is funded by the Correctional Service of Canada. If it is, they won't be able to receive any basic needs support. If the residence is funded by the Ministry of the Solicitor General, they can still receive some basic needs support, but it'll be a reduced amount. The last exception is for someone on temporary absence. Someone who's on temporary absence will still be able to get their income support for the days that they don't spend in custody. But if they're on temporary absence and staying in a community residence funded by the federal government, they won't be able to get their income assistance. If you have a client who receives Ontario Works or ODSP, and they've been taken into custody or are affected by any of these exceptions we just covered, you should remind them that their income support might be reduced because of it. This can help them plan ahead to avoid things like an eviction for not paying rent, or being unable to pay their bills. Someone who's just coming out of custody might also see changes to their income support payments. When someone's released, their income assistance should be reinstated, but their next payment might be reduced to account for the days that they spent in custody. If they spent more than 1 month in custody, though, their support for that month will be suspended. If you have a client who's coming out of custody, there are some things that you can keep in mind. The first is that your client might still be able to get their full monthly shelter support, even if they spent a part of the month in custody. They can get this if they need to maintain their housing, or if they need to secure new housing. So you should always remind them to speak to their caseworker about getting their full shelter support. Another thing you can keep in mind is for a client who's getting room and board in the community after they're released. They might see their monthly payments reduced, and may only get payment for the number of days that they spend in the community, and you can warn them about this. The last thing to keep in mind is that support payments for days spent entering or leaving custody shouldn't be deducted from monthly support amounts. So if this happens to your client, you should help them contact their caseworker. Keeping those in mind, there are also some things that you can do to help a client who's leaving custody. The first thing that you can do is help them notify their caseworker of their upcoming release, if it's possible to do so. This will ensure that their support payments are reinstated on time. You should also remind them to ask their caseworker about getting their full shelter support when they're released. If your client experiences any issues getting their support reinstated once they are released, you should refer them for legal advice. Another thing you can do if your client already received the full amount of their income support in a month where they spent time in custody is to warn them that the program might reduce their payments in the next month or some months later because of an overpayment. Finally, if you have a client who isn't receiving income support but would like to be, you can help them start a new application while they're in custody. If they're applying for Ontario Works, they can call to start a new application 10 days before they're released. If they want to apply to ODSP, they can do it while they're in custody and ask the doctor in the institution to complete their disability determination package. But it might be easier for them to apply for Ontario Works or emergency assistance first, and then apply for ODSP later, since Ontario Works applications get processed faster, and the program pays at the beginning of the month. Now that we've covered those going into custody and those coming out, let's take a look at what might happen to a client who's on parole or probation and receiving income support from Ontario Works or ODSP. Unlike someone who's in custody, someone who's on parole or probation can still receive their income support. But they won't be able to receive any support if they're living in a community residence funded by the federal government. And they'll only be able to receive a portion of their basic needs support if they're living in a community residence funded by the provincial government. If you have a client on parole or probation who's confused about how much money they can get, you can help them contact their caseworker to confirm what they're eligible to receive. If they want to dispute a decision made by Ontario Works or ODSP about those support payments, you should refer them for legal advice and remind them to bring their notice of decision if they have it. The last things we'll cover are some common issues that might come up with income assistance payments. One issue that might come up is a client's income assistance being paid directly to a third party. This can include people like a landlord or a social housing provider or a former partner for child or spousal support. This can sometimes happen with or without your client's consent. But if your client has a change in circumstances that they think might affect the payment to a third party, you should remind them to tell their caseworker about the change. If they want to dispute the decision after speaking to their caseworker, you should refer them for legal advice. Another issue that might come up is someone losing or misplacing their income assistance check. If your client receives their assistance by check and they lose or misplace that check, they might be able to get a replacement, but Ontario Works and ODSP deal with these on a case-by-case basis. So if this happens to your client, you should help them contact their caseworker to explain the circumstances and see if they're eligible for a replacement check. If you have a client who receives income assistance and tells you that they've recently moved, you should also warn them that their checks will go to their previous address if they don't update their caseworker about the move. And you can help them contact their caseworker to provide that updated contact information. And just like that, we've covered income assistance and justice involvement. Until next time.